So welcome back. And for those of you who are just joining us, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I am the director of the Hannah Arendt Humanities Network, which is part of the OSUN Open Society Universities Network. And thrilled to be here today on behalf of my colleagues, Shalini Randera, Leviu Matai, and Ivan Krastev, and the Institute for Wissenschaft Dimension and CEU and Bard College, to announce the recipient of the inaugural Yehuda Elkana Fellowship as Helga Nowotny. When we met the first time and Helga's name was floated, there was pretty much immediate and universal acknowledgement that Helga Nowotny would be the perfect, deserving, and brilliant choice. We called ourselves brilliant for making the choice for the Yehuda Elkana Fellowship. We heard before from a number of people that Yehuda Elkana was gifted at finding and nurturing talent and young people. He had an ability to select people, and this was one of the easiest selections processes I've ever been part of. Looking at Helga Nowotny's work after we made our decision, one was struck by many things, but above all, I was struck that after she was at a conference where some artificial intelligence wrote some haikus, she, on her way home, sat down and, having never written haiku before, wrote the following: human company, invisible algorithms, humanity needs wisdom. Human company, invisible algorithms, humanity needs wisdom. I know she'll talk about this, but this does strike me as embodying the incredible spirit of questioning and engaged thinking that we're here to celebrate tonight. I run the Hannah Arendt Center and the Hannah Arendt Humanities Network. And when I hear humanity needs wisdom, I hear Hannah Arendt saying, we need to think what we are doing. And she makes a similar distinction between thinking and knowledge. Knowledge is things we know, but thinking as this idea of wisdom, of critical thinking, of engaging, of asking the hard, uncomfortable, bold questions that Helga just said that Yehuda liked to ask. Helga Nowotny is one of the world's most prominent scholars of sciences, science studies. As she said, she held a chair for many years in common with Yehuda at ETH in Zurich. She partnered with Yehuda Elkana on many new academic and institutional endeavors. She herself is the author of many books. Some of the most recent ones are An Orderly Mess from 2017, Eigenzeit, Revisited in Die Zeit der Algorithm, 2016, The Cunning of Uncertainty, 2015, Insatiable Curiosity, 2008, Naked Genes, Reinventing the Human in the Molecular Age, 2009. She's the former president of the European Research Council and one of its founding members. We're here today to give her an award for the Yehuda Elkana Fellowship, and also to hear her talk about, and over the next week, a number of us are going to be in conversation with her about her new book, which will be out, I think, later this year. In AI We Trust: Power, Illusion, and Control of Predictive Algorithms. We all crave to know the future. It's a human desire. And I think what's wonderful about Helga and her book and the way she works is she begins with human cravings. We crave to know the future. And we're in a moment, she says, and tells us, where algorithms and artificial intelligence offer an unprecedented look into the future, as well as into the past. And as she explains it, and I'm sure she'll talk about, but the time that artificial intelligence allows us to understand the present expands in both directions. But even as this happens, and this is, I think, one of the beautiful things about her work, she says that the demand for certainty grows, even as we know that we'll never get there. And she says that what we often neglect to ask is, what do the desire and conviction that we can know the future, what does it do to us humans? That kind of question of what does it do to us humans when we put our trust and faith in AI to plan our futures is exactly the kind of question I think we need to be asking. I think it's the kind of question Yehuda Elkana would ask. And it's the reason that I'm honored and thrilled to welcome Helga Nowotny as the Yehuda Elkana Fellowship winner in its inaugural edition. Thank you very much, Helga.
Thank you very much, Roger. This is more than a kind introduction. It's an introduction to my talk, but also it marks something which is very special about this award, because it gives the award winner the possibility to discuss work that has been done with people who have actually read it and to engage in a dialogue. And I look forward to the next coming days. And as I said in a small email note that I wrote to those who will participate, I hope that collectively we will go beyond what is in the book. Because in conversation, in discussion, there are always new ideas, new answers, new questions that come up. So you have heard the title of my book. It will come out early in September. And this is what it will look like. Now, let me quickly give you an overview of my talk, which more or less corresponds to the book. I will begin with what I call a personal journey into Digiland and how I came to focus on predictive algorithms, because the topic, as you know, is vast. The literature is overwhelming and it keeps growing. And so I had to find my own way. Then I go into life in the digital time machine, because I think very briefly, the time of modernity was based on the dominance of the conception of linear time. And now in the digital age, we are confronted with a new kind of time. I call it digital time, but it is really the time of complex systems that have phenomena like emergence, or that know tipping points where all of a sudden the system changes in its state, it enters a transition. Then I go into interacting with the mirror world, where and how we interact with what I call digital others, be they robots, be they other digital devices, beings. And Roger, as I liked your twist on my haiku, actually it said future needs wisdom, but as there can be no future that makes sense to us without humanity, I gladly accept also humanity needs wisdom. And then I come to my conclusions. So let me start with this personal journey into Digiland. Digiland is a vast, dynamic landscape. We are all surrounded with digital devices. We are interacting with them. There are new devices coming up all the time. And we see how digitalization, digital devices, digital technologies seep into our existence, how we work, how we live, how we relate to each other, and how we relate to ourselves. And you all have this experience. So it has become a very widespread collective experience that yet we experience as individuals. The pandemic has perhaps given us a foretaste what life in the digital age will mean, sitting in front of a screen, but at the same time, there's an ambivalence embedded in it, because what would the pandemic have done to us without digitalization? How would we have experienced the social isolation in which we found ourselves? And yet that was alleviated by being able at least to relate digitally to other fellow beings. So we also experience this ambivalence, which is part of this dynamic digital landscape. And of course, it's littered with warning signs. There are famous warning signs like the book by Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism, that really hits by the sheer title. We know what is meant. Surveillance capitalism is out there, it is already there, and we all have this feeling, no, please stop it somehow. Other warning signs are, of course, the monopolies that are created by the large companies that even, when you think of the discussion about bitcoins, etc., where nation states start to get a little bit worried, because the state is founded historically on the monopoly of violence and the monopoly of taxation. So if Bitcoin takes over, what happens to the sovereignty of states and things of this kind? So this is part of my personal journey into Digiland, just giving you a taste of this dynamic landscape that surrounds us. Now, one problem that I encountered early on was how to avoid this trap between utopias, techno nerds that tell us how wonderful the future will be. All problems, whatever they are, can be solved much better. The world will be more productive, more efficient, more fair, whatever you want. Technology will solve the problems. And on the other hand, you have dystopian visions. We know them. The most dystopian, perhaps, that humans will disappear because they will be enslaved by the machines, and the machines will take over. The idea of a general artificial intelligence that will wipe out, our little human brains as they have evolved in the long course of biological evolution. So, and I did not want to fall into this trap. So what did I do? I noticed early on this ambivalence that I already mentioned. We trust AI. We give our data, we trust it to do things for us, we trust it to think for us, to make predictions for us. And by doing this, we entrust human agency to a machine. If you think back of industrialization, what happened is that people gave agency to the machines that would work faster and better and less tiresome than humans. But now this has moved to the cognitive and to the emotional level. And at the same time, we distrust it. We distrust it because there is the fear that we might lose control. We are afraid that our privacy, not an easy notion to take apart, that our privacy will be infringed upon. But basically, it's the anxiety we may lose something that makes us human. So the challenge was, how do I find an entry point into this, landscape? And sometimes I've reading the literature, going to conferences, talking to people. Sometimes I felt myself like in a maze. A maze is a structure that has been designed deliberately so that you get lost. And at times I felt like being in a labyrinth. And a labyrinth is a structure that has been designed to have a center. And, in old cults and religious conceptions, the labyrinth would lead you, if you find your way, it would lead you to the center. And the center in Digiland, in this labyrinth, for me, had something to do with transhumanism. This ancient wish, myth, fantasy, we can leave the body behind and the mind will live on. So all this was very interesting, but I was still looking, what is the way out? My background in science technology studies helped me because from an STS perspective, it's never technology alone. You have to see how the social order and the scientific order interacts together with science and technology, and that the world is inhabited by people who have values, who have practices, who behave in different ways under different social circumstances. And all this has to come together. So finally, I thought, well, the entry point that I want to use are predictive algorithms. Because, as Roger already mentioned, and also given my previous work on time and on uncertainty, we want to know the future, and predictions are about the future. So if I focus on predictive algorithm, I've gained a foothold in this landscape, and I can try to make some sense of it. So predictive algorithms bring us, of course, to questions of meaning and agency and how this is related to our interaction with digital machines. But of course, something that Yehuda would also have liked very much, context matters. Let's not forget the context. And the context is the larger picture. And here you can, of course, say, well, digitalization it's new, but at the same time, as humanity, as the human species, we have had other large economic technological paradigm changes, beginning with industrialization, or what historians of economics and of innovation call radical innovations, that change the way how a society functions or how an economy functions. So this is perhaps just another one. Yes and no. It is another one, and yet it is different. And economic historians like Carlota Perez has detailed in a very interesting way what happens and what are similarities in these socioeconomic paradigm changes. There are waves and how this trickles down in a society. But she found an interesting similarity in all of these paradigm changes, namely, they lead, at least temporarily, to a concentration of power, of economic power, of political power, and only, at least historically speaking, when governments intervened, broke up this concentration of power, was wealth and the benefits that came from it more evenly distributed. The future is open, and we will see what happens this time. But we clearly see again what Carlota Perez describes, the concentration of wealth. And you have read all the figures of how people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others, how their wealth accumulated even during the pandemic, while others, went into the poverty trap. So, but there is something else that is different this time, and this is related to this cognitive and emotional agency that we transfer to predictive algorithm. And what I mean by this, it's we transfer the ability, the agency to think, but also to feel. If people say, I think the AI knows me better than I do myself. It knows how I feel because it can measure, even when I sleep, what my mood is, when I'm dreaming. There is a machine and an algorithm that can show what happens in my unconscious even. So this is what I mean by attributing cognitive and emotional agency to these predictive algorithms, because the data from the past will go and tell you what will happen in the future. Just a little footnote, I use the term digitalization, digital devices, as a kind of umbrella term. I'm not going into the differences between machine learning and et cetera, but I just wanted to remind us where we stand today. And this is the outcome of 3 different strands. We have an enormous amount of data and access to an enormous amount of data that keeps growing, data of all kinds. We have ever clever algorithms which are trained and fed through these data, and they continue to become more clever the more data they get. And we have unprecedented computational power. So this is the basis of where we stand and whatever will happen. And the question, of course, is what does this mean, this question about our humanity in the digital age? But it happens to coincide with an unprecedented sustainability crisis. We soon will reach the formidable number of 9 billion people on the planet that have to be fed, that expect some kind of, and deserve some kind of decent living on this planet. And it's getting crowded on the planet. And if you look at what other living organisms do, they all have carved out their niche in their environment. And our only niche right now as humanity is this planet that we have. Some may dream of going into outer space, but this may take time, if it ever happens, as a living quarter that is hospitable to humans. But so this niche will be a digital niche. So let me now turn to life in the digital time machine. And I want to begin with this question, when did it all begin? And by it, I mean, this coming together of the different strands, digitalization in this umbrella term, like way. And it begins, it's always tricky if you ask for beginnings, because there are origin stories, there are origin myths. We know sometimes it's very arbitrary that you say, it begins on that day or in that year or in that epoch, because things happen simultaneously in other places at other times. But nevertheless, for the sake of convenience, we can pinpoint to something that happened in the midst of the last century, the 20th century, in the 40s and 50s, and then went on in the 60s. And it's remarkable. It happened in one place, of course, also in other places, but in one place, the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, and it was the time during the war effort when scientists and engineers came together to also work together under the Manhattan Project, which then took place at another location, to produce the atomic bomb in the fight against Nazi Germany. But at the same time, and this I find very interesting, the geographers now locate the beginning of the so-called Anthropocene. When did humanity begin to intervene and change the Earth system? That's the question that Paul Crutzen, asked himself when he said in a talk in 2000, the year 2000, we live now in the Anthropocene. And for me, it's interesting that this coming together of mathematical symbols, I mean, Alan Turing was one of the pioneers, but the Turing machine was not a machine. It was a set of mathematical equations. But this came together with the materiality of building a computer, a machine that would run the mathematical code in an electronic way. And this coming together was really the twin birth of the digital universe and the Anthropocene. Now, as I briefly mentioned before, digital time, it's an abstract time of mathematics. You can reverse it, you can speed it up, you can intersect, you can do all kinds of things with it. As such, it is unremarkable, or it's just, part of the mathematical world of mathematical symbols and ideas. But the moment these digital devices invade our life, our work, our way of being, our relationships, this kind of digital time starts to interact with social time that coordinates how we live. We are bound by the biological arrow that goes from birth to death. And this is an interesting way in which multiple temporalities come together. Add to it the confrontation with different time scales. When we speak about the Anthropocene, when we start to worry or model future models of climate change and the various catastrophic tipping points that we may reach sooner or later, all this is related to different time scales than our human time scales. And somehow we now have to grapple and bring these different time scales together, make sense of them, and find a way out if we do not want our system to collapse. But this digital time changes also our temporal bearings. And by this, I mean the relationship between past, present, and future. And in every society, you have these three conceptions. People distinguish what was past, what is present, what is future. But what belongs to the past and what relationship there is between past, present, and future can change quite dramatically. If you go back to Europe in the Middle Ages, people believed in the life after death. So there was a future, but it was a future that had been set. It was the afterlife that had been religiously settled, and that was it. So there was no idea of an open future. And so now we have this, a blurring of the boundaries between these concepts. And what digital devices can do is, as already mentioned, they bring the past into the present. If you see pictures in the newspapers, on television, of outer space, you all witnessed, first it was Perseverance that landed on Mars, then the Chinese landing piece came, and it can do other things, and it lands in different, it happens right now. And yet everything we know about outer space, it's light years away. And so the past is brought into the present. And the future is already here. As William Gibson once said, it's only unevenly distributed. It's here, at least partially, in the digital devices that surround us. And this makes living in the present a bit intense and compressed. And we very often feel both informationally and emotionally overloaded. But, and this is a very important but, the future that we can have now much better access to through the predictive algorithm, it is still an open and an inherently uncertain future. And people everywhere around the world always wanted to know the future. I find these Chinese oracle bones fascinating because there was an elaborate technology behind carving the cracks and developing the cracks by holding shoulder bones of goats or turtles above fire. And these were expert technologists in forecasting, and they started to interpret the cracks that appeared. But now people believe that this was also the origin of the Chinese script. So it's an interesting way how, wanting to look into the future, humans invented a technology that allows to preserve part of the past through writing. And there are other very interesting things that happen once you start into the history of oracles. Today, we no longer practice looking into the oracle bones, or some people may still look at horoscopes, but practically we have left the role of oracles behind us. We have switched to predictive algorithms. And Elena Esposito makes an interesting point. She has worked also on oracles, and she says in the 18th and 19th century, when statistics became the basis for modernization and how to run a country, the whole bureaucracy was based on statistics, extracting the information from numbers. These were always aggregates, while predictive algorithms can target individuals. And it's no longer just the aggregate. And there is a similarity, she says, to oracles, because when you went to consult an oracle, the oracle was speaking to you as the supplicant and told you what to expect, whether you should go to war or not, whether you would survive or not. And we know the many stories that are connected in Greek mythology, etc., with oracles. So, and now what happens now is that we integrate these algorithms into decision-making. And in the US, it is already practice that courts use predictive algorithms, policing uses predictive algorithm, insurance companies, businesses have products that can be bought that tell you how to automate decision-making in your firm. Of course, there are still humans that may make a final decision, but by and large, we can see how algorithmic-based decision-making seeps into institutions, business, social behavior, fitness bands. They tell you what are your risks in terms of health, how you should change your lifestyle. All that is very familiar, but also how we see the future. And there I see one of the biggest risks for us that come from putting too much belief into the predictive algorithm, of transferring agency to them without reminding ourselves that humans were the ones who designed them, and that also predictive algorithm cannot know the future because it remains uncertain. They can only allow you to see in a certain direction with a certain probability. And if we forget that, at least social behavior can easily turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. People believe what they see, the situation is defined as real, and they act according to the situation defined as real. And here, and this is of course a question mark, but it is the risk that we may end up with another deterministic, high-tech, deterministic worldview. And remember, for thousands of years, humanity, in various ways, clad in myths and stories, believed the future has already been set by God, the gods, by fate, you name it. But it has been set, and all humans could do is, to pray and to get perhaps a little hint from above what to avoid or not. But basically, there was no escape. And for me, one of the greatest human inventions is the discovery of the open horizon of the future. And according to historian Reinhard Koselleck, this happens in what he calls the subtle side, the settled time, roughly between 1750 and 1850, when the gap opened between the experience that people had living like their parents, the same kind of lives, the same kind of outlooks to the future, and the expectations. And all of a sudden, this gap started to widen. And people realized there is an open horizon of the future. We can live a different life than that of our parents and grandparents. And of course, this was also the beginning of aspirations of modernization, of the Enlightenment, etc., etc. So much for the risk. Let me now turn briefly, at least, to our interaction with the mirror world, which is the world created by us through these taking in the information through sensors of the outer environment, of our body, our inner environment, of what happens, what is in our environment, but also what happens. So it's a very dynamic and interactive mirror world that we are creating. It externalizes what we know, how we know, why we know, and it is an extension of what we know, how we know, and the purposes of our knowing. Of course, the externalization of knowledge began a long time ago, when people, famous, of course, with inventing writing as the technology that allowed to externalize what people knew and to transmit it to others and to the next generations. The printing press, libraries, places of externalizing knowledge. But all these examples in the past were media of communicating. While now we are externalizing also to objects. You have 3D printing. You have objects with which you interact and with which you exchange constantly. We look at what happens through satellites, for instance, the deforestation of the planet. We scrape the deep ocean floor to find new minerals. We have unprecedented knowledge about the genetics and what happens inside the body. And all this knowledge is externalized because we have biobanks, we have data bank, and we interact and do something with this knowledge. So this is the mirror world, and I find it fascinating because it's not a replica, but it tells us something about us, and mirrors make us ask questions. Who am I? And this is where our interaction with digital others come in, but especially it gives rise to identity anxieties. And I'm sure there are several of you who have been working on, the contestation, the political contestation of identity claims. In the political realm, there's the so-called identity politics. It's a hot topic, but there is also this other side of identity anxiety that is less tangible. There are these digital entities around us. What do they do to us? How do they change what we see to be, and how we identify ourselves? And what is the question, what is an authentic self? Now, to move on to the last part of my book and my talk, I call it Future Needs Wisdom. And it was partly triggered the preoccupation in this part of my book, because I encountered in my journey through Digiland that whenever the conversation became a bit uncomfortable, veering a bit towards the dystopian or the warning signs that I talked about initially, went up and said, wait a moment, it could turn into something we do not want. Then the answer was always, well, but we have ethics. Let's just design an ethical AI. Let's design a benign, a beneficial AI. Let's align human values with AI. These are the answers that are given by well-intentioned and well-meaning people who work with the technology. But my feeling is that this ubiquitous call for ethics will not be sufficient because, first of all, there are more technical problems than people realize, but also because it can never satisfy every situation in which such a call of ethics is being called for. Values, human values, it's wonderful if you work on alignment of human values with an AI. But what many people don't realize, human values change. They are not immutable. They are not hewn into stone. And how to build this in is an interesting project. It should be pursued, but we should guard from the illusion that it will solve all the problems that we will encounter. And this is why I like to look at the problems as pathologies of AI. If you speak about, which is, discussed, you open the newspaper, you find an article on bias, on discrimination. You look at Google translation of languages and you fall into the gender stereotypes because Google knows only how to translate according to gender. All this is discussed on a day-to-day basis, but we don't have any solution to it. If you think of other pathologies that come up with what will it do to the future of work, if automation proceeds much faster, then new jobs will be created. And this is an open question that no one can answer at the moment. What will it do to those who have no chance because automation wipes out their jobs? Or if you think of the risk to liberal democracy, and we have seen a foretaste of hacking, of cyberspace, of activities where deliberately fake news are being propagated, etc. So all these are pathologies. And I like to use the term pathology because it reminds us, like illnesses, perhaps they can be cured. But also we cure some illnesses, but we can be sure that other illnesses will come. So it is something that we have to live with. We have to find ways of constantly dealing with this. And this is why I think wisdom is needed. And wisdom for me is not just to have a few wise old men or women around. It's nice if you have them. But you need an ethos, a set of practices, of attitudes that help you in a specific situation to regard the social context and to adapt to the social context and to give answers that fit for this particular context and that may not be as generalizable as some people may want. And so these are the thorny issues that will be with us, the politics of classification. If we speak about bias and discrimination, it starts with how we build our categories. And historians like Ian Hacking and others, have done very solid work on that. How categories form people. Ian Hacking's famous book title, Making Up People, the way how medical diagnoses were creating illnesses because people started to conform to the diagnosis they were being given. So this needs wisdom, and I don't have the time to go into the question about new narratives. only so far, because I mentioned before that Yehuda would encourage us to rethink the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment had one guiding principle, and this was, how can we create public happiness? A question that in the 21st century, in highly individualized societies, strikes us as somewhat odd. Happiness has been privatized. We have a happiness industry that flourishes. But who speaks about public happiness? And yet, for the Enlightenment, the quest for public happiness was at the forefront. Now, they understood it in a particular way in the 18th century, and they thought, people need to be well fed. There has to be enough food. And so they started to look for the starch content of food. And this is where potatoes come in, or the exotic breadfruit that is also high in starch content. And if you have a well-fed population, people are happy because they don't go hungry. And this was one way of answering public happiness. But I think the question still resonates loudly for the 21st century. What do we do about public happiness, or what is the narrative that we want to use? Now, let me wrap up, because I really would like to enter in a discussion with you. If you look back at evolution, and I think given the fact that we are now these almost 9 billion people on the planet, we also have to take this look back, starting with biological evolution. Where did life come from? We now discuss, is there life in outer space, or is it limited to here? Where did life come from? This long stretch of biological evolution. But then something very remarkable happened with the human species. Cultural evolution overtook biological evolution, which happened with no other species than humans. And in particular, it's science and technology that is pushing and speeding up the cultural evolution, which is the basis of where we find ourselves now. And therefore, I think we may put this evolutionary perspective, we as the result of biological and cultural evolution, together with a new co-evolutionary path with the digital machines that we have created. And as with evolution, there is no telos that is built into it. There is no rules that will tell you what the outcome will be, because new rules also evolve. They are not set and will be followed all the time, and therefore it's an open-ended outcome. But we interact more and more intimately with these digital machines, and it will shape us and the way how we continue to design these machines. Now, predictive algorithm, as mentioned, they let us see further into the future. They cannot yet answer the question why, which is a very human question. And some people say, well, people work on it. There's a new branch of mathematics trying, to get closer to answering this question. But more perhaps than the question of answering why, because we have different ways of answering the question why, I think what is offered by predictive algorithm for us is to ask the question, what if? To open up this space of the human imagination, to make simulation models, to let us discuss, if we do X, we get Y or Z, and under which conditions do we get Y or Z? And this is what complex systems allow you at least to get a feeling for how to answer this question, what if? Now, algorithms, they are nothing to be afraid of. I think also sometimes, this dystopian view hits back to us. It's the algorithm to which we confer agency, and it appears to be a monster. I don't think that this is the way to look at them. I would prefer that we treat them as children. And this means you have to educate children, and even more, you have to socialize them into the kind of society where you want them to be a valuable member of the society. And being a valuable member means to take responsibility and to be ready to be held accountable. So since we are here with many of you coming from the social sciences and humanities, I think the important question that is offered to us by using predictive algorithm and the world they open, this space of imagination, is to ask the question, what if? And with it comes the question, could it be otherwise? And to end here with what Yehuda would have said, he would have said, yes, it can be otherwise. Thank you. I think Roger gets an instruction for the microphone.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Helga. We are now open for the discussion. I know if you have discussion, if you're online, you can put your questions in the chat. Humans can be made accountable, and only humans have the freedom to take on responsibility. Thus, AI is usually based on human mentality. So indeed, who will guard the guardians themselves? How can we make AI more accessible to those who lack power?
Well, power is a big question. It is with us in every relationship, I would say. It permeates society. And with algorithms, with AI, it gets an added tool, how to exert power. I don't know where Denise is, but I suppose she is somewhere in the chat. Okay. So, power is with us. Power needs to be curbed. If we want to live in a society where we believe that humans are equal, another big, claim of the Enlightenment, even if we know all the deficiencies, that this claim still suffers, then power needs to be curbed. And the call for regulating AI is, of course, nothing new. But we also see the massive vested economic interests of large corporations, and they are helped, as we have been witnessing these days at the G7 discussions. It's very obvious, unless you find ways of curbing power and regulating this very minor tax regulation, globally, it will not work. And so it will no longer be sufficient if a country says, okay, we will be in the avant-garde, we will try to set up a regulation. If it's not done at the global scale, it will not work. And this pushes us to adopt a much more global and open perspective. And so this is one of my, I must admit, only partial answers, but I think nobody has the answer to this very difficult and important question.
Is there a question here? Yes, please state your name and then ask your question.
Hello, my name's Aaron Lambert, and thank you for the talk. It's very, very interesting and fascinating, actually. And I had my question is about wisdom, which you mentioned, and were so bold as to give it a definition of. And I find it interesting that wisdom as a, let's say, a category of human capability. I wouldn't, to avoid the term, putting the term knowledge into wisdom. So wisdom has become more legitimate, I think, as a category of human capability that is a legitimate topic of academic discourse in more recent years. And your definition has to do with knowing how, in a particular situation, how to relate ourselves to others in society. That's how I understood it, at least partly what you said. And that came to mind a difference between knowledge, that and know-how. And I was wondering if, in your view, wisdom also has to do with know-how of a particular kind, and if that adds anything to what you said about wisdom.
Well, I mean, know-how is always good to have, because if you want to give answers, solutions, try to do justice to particular contexts and particular situations, it is good to know more than just knowing there is something out there and you treat it in the same way. And it is this contextual sensitivity, I would say, that is part of approaching this ethos of wisdom, that you are ready to listen, to participate, and then try, if possible, to work out with the people in that particular situation what solutions might or might not work, rather than coming in and saying, I have the solution for you. This was the approach of modernity. We had solutions that came from above. We had solutions that were prefabricated, that were distributed across, be it the territory, be it the population. And I think now know-how and wisdom have to go beyond that by bringing in people and working on solutions together with them.
There's another question from Dilara Boga on the chat, and she asks, how can we educate AIs morally and treat them like children if they lack social emotions and the capacity for rational deliberation? And are they too predictable, I guess is the question she's asking. Mm-hmm. And since they don't have their own moral autonomy, how can they be educated?
That's a very good question. I don't have the answer, but I think if you treat them as children, you as a parent, you are always one step ahead of the child. At the same time, you have to bring the child up to certain standards. Of course, I'm not saying an AI is autonomous in the sense of being a moral being. And the emphasis that I would put here on what I said is like children. They are not children, but you can treat them like children. And by educating children, you explain to them, you try to give them the kind of feedback. If you do this, this will happen. And, it's an open process. So I need everyone who is working on this problem to come together and to take it one step further. I'm not here as the educator of AI and treating them as children. I'm appealing to you, instead of being afraid of the AI, let's try to educate them like children.
Eric Prem, Vienna University of Technology, and Utima, thank you so much for your presentation. Helga, I know you have a background in science and technology studies, so maybe it's an easier question for you, but I was wondering, artificial intelligence is a strange field, even for computer scientists who used to not understand it very well, and now it's changing a bit, but still, it is kind of strange. And I was wondering if during your work on the book, were there moments or insights where you felt particularly this is really strange, or this is actually great and fascinating? Were there those moments where you found something particularly worrying or particularly exciting?
Well, my worries are the worries that I think everyone here in the room would share. And the greatest worries is that we have human beings, who misuse and abuse AIs. So it's not the AI per se, it's what humans do with it. And my greatest worries, of course, is the further development of autonomous weapons. And we now had, I think, one accident that was reported of a so-called autonomous weapon system that went berserk, but it was allowed to do, a number of things that were not very clear. So, they had been handed over control over certain decisions. So these are my worries, and there are many other worries of this kind. But strange and exciting. What I find exciting is this coming together of, mathematics, an equation that does not tell you very much if you're not in mathematics, and you combine it with a bit of hardware, with a machinery that works. Taken by itself, the machinery is not so impressive. Taken by itself, the equation is not, they may be impressive for people who solve the Fermi's theorem or whatever, but to normal human beings that are not trained in mathematics, it's not so fast. But this coming together, this is what I find fascinating. It does not explain AI per se, but the materiality of the world, and at the same time, this abstractness of thoughts, symbols, and of course, there are long, old philosophical traditions, Platonism, etc. Is mathematics describing a real world? Is it part of the real world? Is it a world apart, etc.? So I cannot go into that. But what I find fascinating is this combination. And at the same time, there are people, of course, when something new comes up, we always compare it with what we know already. So when the first, genes were described, sequenced, etc., people did not know what to make of it. What does a gene look like? And it turned out even the number of genes in the human body, we were far off the mark. So we had no idea. But then you look for what is the next familiar thing? So people said, well, genes are like computers, because computers were already known. And now, we try to compare again AI with things that we know, but we know much more. And so some people say, well, it's like we look into biology, and we see there are many life processes that are computations. And so you can explain, in parentheses, through computation, what happens in the body and what happens in the machine. These are crutches of thinking, because it's new, but we have created what is new. And eventually we will know more, and we will have better ways of describing. But of course, the danger is, and this happened for, can you hear me if I can hear?
Yeah, but
I'm sorry. So what happened, for instance, with when the first human genome was sequenced, you had all these discussions, or when the Dolly the sheep was cloned. Some of you may still remember, the first cloning. People out there, they got worried, they got all the wrong ideas, and then you get these answers. Well, what is the gene for? We don't have genes for being intelligent, for stupid, for being good, or for being bad, whatever. This is nonsense. But to help also society on this way, while we in science try to find new ways of describing, of settling, of understanding better, how do we convey this to the general public? And this is a huge responsibility, because otherwise people fall into the trap, and then we get anti-vaxxers and others, etc., because there's a lack of understanding behind it. But also people get worried. And so in the book, I describe also how science in the past has made huge mistakes, and this is acknowledged, of course, and the worst, I would almost say, crime is defining race and racism as having a scientific basis. But also differences between men and women as being genetically determined and regulating behavior, etc. All this, science thought this is scientific in the 19th century. It was conveyed to and legitimized and used politically to claim the superiority of the white race, etc., etc. So here it's not just making AI responsible, but I'm also appealing to the responsibility of scientists to convey this fascinating journey on which we are, but at the same time, there are no certainties that we can give. And therefore, we also have to educate society to embrace uncertainty.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take one or two, or one from the chat. Maria Kronfeldner, who's a CEU professor, asks, there's one comment and then two questions related to it. The comment is, the technology changes very quickly, as quick as viruses may be. Global governance, however, is very slow. The slower, the more global it is. So then the questions are, first, what does that tell us about the meaning of time or the future for us? And second, are we overwhelmed by change? The change of viruses and technology, such that determinism becomes almost the new chance for us?
No, I don't think determinism is a new chance for us. But let me try to unravel, because there were several questions in one together. Just remind me of the last one before determinism.
What does this tell us about the meaning of time?
No, the next one.
Are we overwhelmed by the change, and thus determinism has a new chance?
Yeah. No, I mean, being overwhelmed by change happens again and again. If you go back, and this has been extremely well described by historians, when industrialization happened, in the medical field, you had a new diagnosis, neurasthenics. Everyone who was overwhelmed by modernization had neurasthenics. People were believing that driving a car, would hurt your perception, etc. So this happens again and again. And but I would say it's not so much the speed. During modernity, it was the speed. It goes faster and faster. With computers, we cannot compete with computers. We cannot even imagine how fast computers work. It's beyond our, biological way of comprehending. So we don't have this feeling anymore. Speed per se is overwhelming us. What is overwhelming many is the complexity. Not being able to find your way when there are too many layers, too many interacting dimensions that come together. And then we have, as the reaction, the search for very simple world views, coherence. One reason why we have so many conspiracy theories is conspiracy theories give you a coherent explanation. And coherence is the key to it. Yeah. And the world is not coherent in this sense. And therefore, I think we also have to further an understanding of what a complex world is like. And time, I think I've answered it. It's not speed, it's not acceleration. It is the feeling everything happens at the same time, which is the other side of complexity. If everything happens at the same time, how do you cope with it? And you have so many different demands, and yet you know you have only 24 hours. And also in terms of biographies and life course, etc., it changes. So I answered only part of the question, but I hope goes in the right direction.
That's good. Is there a question in the room? Yes, we'll do one here and then one here. These two.
Thank you very much, Helga. My name is Barbara Breinsack. I'm based here at the University of Vienna. And I had the pleasure of reading your book over the last week. And what you now said in our discussion about treating AI like children, when I read this in the book, I thought it was a bold move because it's kind of counterintuitive almost in the sense that it goes against this notion that we shouldn't anthropomorphize AI, but you're drawing an analogy. And I think you also single-handedly then solved the liability question, right? If we treat AI as children, then the liability question is solved as well. But if we push that analogy a little bit further, I think what makes something human is not only the status that we attribute to it, but also being embedded in a network of relations with humans. So my question for you is, how far would you go how far would you go with this analogy? Would you go as far as saying maybe eventually we need something like a person's status for artificial intelligence, or is that really crossing a line for you?
You know, I've followed only from afar the discussions about, you know, granting personhood, be it to animals, be it to AI, and of course it's a perfectly legitimate question. On the other hand, I feel a bit uneasy as long as we live in a society where through our behavior, through laws, you know, we deny some of the most fundamental human rights to our fellow human beings. You know, it makes me uneasy that we then discuss what about personhood. I know that these are different levels, and I realize it. But at the same time, I feel we have still so much to do in terms of what we do now, you know, to refugees, to asylum seekers, etc., where the basic human rights that everyone signs up in principle are denied in reality, you know, that I feel we should sort of set priorities in terms of where to concentrate our energy. But, we have become a more inclusive society in general. If you look back historically, we have incorporated disabilities. If you think back only, 70, 80 years old, a disabled person in a rural neighborhood in Austria or somewhere else, people were ridiculed, people, were pushed to the margins, etc. So we have made some progress there. We are more inclusive in terms of animals and animal rights. And so from this sense, I would say, let's also become more inclusive with regard to these digital others. But I would still, treat them as they have a special status. They are digital others. Whether they are persons, I don't know, or whether they are like persons, I don't know. But once you start to think what makes them different, you discover there are similarities and differences, and robots are a good example. You know, they are like us because they have been designed so that we interact more naturally with them, more socially correct with them. At the same time, we know robots and the robotic intelligence behind them is very different from human intelligence, and this will not change. So to design a special status, but, you know, intuitively, I would say a person is a person. And for me, neither an animal nor an AI is a person.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Nischal Dungel, and I'm a graduate student at Bard College. So yeah, I'll directly head towards the question. So as we have seen that with the rapid surge in economic growth, right? So there was population growth and also a rapid rise in energy use as well. So along with this rapid rise in economic growth, we have seen the rise in like many environmental problems such as rise in like greenhouse gases, deforestation, or ocean acidification, right? So my question is like, with the rise of these all economic growth and this, we have seen the rise in environmental problems as well. So this clearly means that we have utilized our resources in unsustainable ways. So with the rise of these all cloud computing and blockchain technologies, right, we have to make a great energy transition in this. We all know how much energy we require for this cloud computing and blockchain technology. So what do you think, or what will be the future of this sustainability as there is a rapid rise in like artificial intelligence and predictive algorithm? Do you think that we'll be able to solve this problem of sustainability with all these technological developments?
Thank you for the question. I think nobody knows whether we will be able to solve the problem. The problem is huge. We face an unprecedented sustainability crisis. And the problem gets worse every day. And, you know, heat waves and droughts are only one or two indicators of what else is happening. But I mentioned before, you know, like other organisms in the natural environment, you know, worms or octopuses, they all dig out their niche, their environmental niche in which they live. And the human species has only this planet. This is our niche. And if we want to continue to live halfway decent on this planet, we need digital technology to help us doing this. But how it will be done, we need a much more holistic approach to these questions. And now we still segment it, and people look at energy consumption only, and others look only at biodiversity, and others know everything about planting trees and soil erosion and acidification of oceans, etc. But we need to bring this together. And this is a holistic way of looking, thinking, and doing research on it that is needed.
Renata.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I also had the privilege to read your manuscript and analysis of technology and perfect point. When you spoke about children, here, you know, I started thinking usually as parents have fantasies of children, how we should turn out, and you know, usually we hope that they will be good. But one thing of growing up is fighting against your parents and distancing yourself and going your own way. So there is, I would say, a slight danger here with treating AI as children. And also, since we are in the city of Sigmund Freud, we can say that, you know, our children usually complain that we gave them trauma, you know, didn't raise them properly, and so on. So if the AI develops its own unconscious, you know, I worry, you know, who will sort of treat them, or you know, what kind of psychoanalysis they might need in the future with trauma that they sort of about from parents.
Okay, I will in future be very careful in using this analogy because, I do not want to encourage the thinking that these AI become more and more autonomous. They, acquire a will of their own. This is part of what I consider science fiction. And I find it fascinating to read the science fiction because it opens many interesting questions. But I don't think that this is where we are going in the future. And what makes me hopeful instead of pessimistic is that we have this this creative spark of imagination and opening up, and AI, we can use it in different ways. We have a digital knowledge space that is in principle open for us to explore in novel ways. We only have to start doing research in a different way that helps us to understand this better, of putting pieces of the puzzles together. And hence, I am perhaps also still rooted in the Enlightenment, even if I know about the drawbacks of the Enlightenment. But I think there is something in humans that enables us to push further and to develop new perspectives on the world that are also for the human good.
We are unfortunately out of time. I know there's a number of questions still in the chat and I imagine in the room, but for now, please join me in thanking Helga Nowotny. Thank you.
Thank you.